Every day there is a forgetting, and every moment there is the possibility of remembering. Remembering who you truly are, awakening to your body, to the inner world and experience of being alive. Here is where you find the beauty, the joy. Here is where you free your soma.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Free Your Soma, Stories of Somatic Awakening and How to Live from the Inside Out. Today, I have a friend and colleague here, Michelle Dowd. She is a professor of journalism at Chaffey College. She's a yoga teacher, which is how we know each other. She's a writer whose work has been featured in many national publications, and she has a book that's come out this year that I just finished reading called Forager. It came out in March, and we're going to talk about the book. We're going to talk about her healing journey and her path, and about some of the kind of broader scope of her work. So thank you for being here with me today, Michelle.
Thank you, Amy. So lovely to see you again.
Yes. Yes. So we met some years ago at Claremont Yoga, when I first was sort of like a student there, sort of, pretending I wasn't a teacher. I wanted to be anonymous for a little bit, which felt good. And then eventually it was kind of discovered like, oh, I'm a teacher. And then I decided to do the teacher training there, and you were part of that yoga training, and supported me during my teacher training. And yeah, that's kind of our connection has been through yoga. But now we've been kind of connecting about somatics and connecting about healing work, because you have done this really tremendous thing, and you've published this book that is a memoir of the things that you went through as a little girl and growing up in a very unusual situation. Would you tell our listeners a little bit about your background?
Thank you, Amy. First of all, let me also thank you for creating this healing space for listeners. I am also a listener of yours, and so I appreciate the conversations that I have been privy to through you. Thank you. My background as a child was being raised in a cult that my grandfather started, and I call it a family cult because it literally was the cult of my family. It was family business. And my grandfather started it, and he had 5 children, one of whom was my mother. And those 5 children stayed in the cult their whole lives and worked with and for him. And then they had kids of their own. So there were 15 biological grandchildren who were all raised collectively under the confines of this particular cult.
Gotcha.
Our nuclear family, my mother and her husband, who was also raised by my grandfather, although he wasn't related to him, my father and my mother brought their 4 biological children up to a mountain that my grandfather had leased back in the 1940s as part of his cult organization, and had not used to the extent that he thought he was going to use it in the 1940s. He thought he was going to make a school and just a place to house boys where, I don't know if he knew if it would be a boarding school or just basically a place to keep the boys away from their families. And so it was empty when we moved there. And my mother was charged with her husband, my father, and creating a space that my grandfather could eventually use.
Got you. So you say a cult, but like people who are in a cult don't often think they're in a cult. They think they're in something else. Was it organized as a church? Was he like a minister of some kind?
So my grandfather's a minister, but he was non-denominational. He did not have any training whatsoever in the ministry. He just was self-ordained and like self-professed prophet of God. I think that, yes, he ran a church, but I think it was more that he housed it under the auspices of a sports organization for boys. He did not call it a cult. To this day, they do not ever admit that it was a cult or that it still is. But when my grandfather started it, he started as an after-school program for boys. He was a Boy Scout leader, and he didn't find that he didn't have enough control as a Boy Scout leader. So he took the boys that he had from Boy Scouts, and in 1931 created his own organization for boys. And in the 30s, before he even met my grandmother, so before he got married, he was a very young man who was an orphan and had come from Oklahoma to California to Hollywood. He may or may not have acted in silent films. He said he did. He also said he was educated, which he was not. And then he kind of created a lore about himself because he had no family, and he used the boys to create a family for himself. And from his original troupe in the early 1930s, two of the brothers and one of the other young men followed him through every single thing he did until they or he died, depending on who died first. And none of them died until at least the 80s. So all of those men followed him for at least 50 years. And when I said followed him, did not have jobs, didn't do anything else but devote themselves to his service.
Wow. This is not something that you talk about a whole lot in the book, because the book is really about your experience, and it's first person, the way you write it. And I listened to the audiobook, which was super cool because it was your voice reading it. So I really felt like kind of the impact of like your words, the tone of your voice. I felt like you were very much in character when you were your younger versions of yourself. And it was really lovely to kind of hear the way your writing evolved as you evolved as a young person. But what you're telling me now, like, I'm feeling like, wow, there's like a whole nother side to this scenario, which is like what the men were going through and the kind of control that they were under, which would be a completely different book, obviously. But there's another side to the story that I'm sort of just glimpsing at right now.
Well, yes, and I think it was very influential to the way I was raised. When I decided how to frame the book, I decided that it would be very complicated to tell the stories of people who, A, did not choose to have their stories told in that way, two, had lied their entire lives about everything. And so while I was unearthing many of the truths, it felt to me that it would be a separate book to tell that story. So the book that I'm working on now is a little bit more of a prequel to take us like into the space that my mother was born into. And in the book, my mom is definitely a central character, and someone who I think people feel that I had a very complicated relationship, which I did. But I came to believe through doing the research for the book and in the process of writing it, that my mother was also a victim of a cult. It wasn't the same cult in the sense that, how any child born into a family, they're having a different experience, even if it's 2 years later. Well, I was a whole generation later. So of course, the way my mother was raised was very different. And it was entirely a boys' organization when my mom was being raised. And so she was in an all-male cult, and I was in a mostly male cult. And so for me to understand the way that men were treated was really the only experience that I had. And my father did try to treat all of us. He had 4 children, 3 of whom were girls, all of us as boys, because that was his only experience with being a person. Like, he only saw the world through very male eyes.
Gotcha. Yes. And that's really clear in the book as you're kind of talking about the things that you're raised believing about your body and about being a woman, that it's from a very specific kind of male perspective that really is about detaching you from your nature and your body, and more about control than anything else, more about being subservient and having the control of you and who you are outside of you, that you're there and living there to serve others, specifically men, as being the kind of the construct in which you were raised in. And it's quite intense, especially since, in modern times, as we're listening to this, it sounds, kind of archaic and like, whoa, hey, we've already, moved on from that. But you're kind of reminding all of us that it's really not that far in our past, that this was the reality of how people were raised, and of course there's variation. Like, this is kind of an extreme example, but in the grander scheme of things, like, it was not that long ago that women didn't have voting rights, that women couldn't own property, all of that, right? And so it's really interesting how you illustrate that through your living experience of it in the book.
Yes, and I think we all are living in a culture that has the residuals of a very strong patriarchy. We are still very patrilineal, not exclusively patrilineal, but primarily. And there are a lot of aspects of our culture and capitalism that are embedded in a very male way of constructing business. So I think it's worth examining not only my story, but the ways in which all of us have been influenced by a patriarchal mindset, and the way as women that we have to unpack that a little bit for ourselves in order to embrace our bodies and embrace the parts of ourselves that we want to celebrate as intuitive. I think a lot of that has not been celebrated in our culture and has not been respected.
Yeah, you know, and hearing you say that, I want to go back to you mentioned your mother earlier and the relationship that you had with her. And, you know, what I found so fascinating in the book is the way that she is so tuned into her environment, meaning she's so tuned into the natural world. But when it comes to actually tending to her children, there's like a disconnect, like she's unable to really give you the nurture and the care that you need. And yet the way that she is like allowed to do that maybe is through training you to survive nature and to survive the world. And that's almost like the form that her love takes, because she doesn't have another way. It seems maybe there's some kind of disconnect in her body even that doesn't allow her to do that kind of things that we expect from traditional mothers, nurturing, caring. And it, you know, and I felt it. I felt your need for that as a little girl in the book. And there was a lot of sorrow that I experienced in feeling that that wasn't something you were receiving. And so there was a negotiation. You had to find that in nature. You had to find that in the natural world.
Definitely. When I look back at the child self, I spent a great deal of time trying to earn my mother's love or convince her or just get her attention. And I wonder now, even if she was perhaps autistic, that is something that has occurred to me. I know she was not diagnosed with anything, but she also didn't go to doctors, and she certainly never went to a psychologist her entire life, nor did she respect that as a science, so she didn't read about it either. But I wonder, there was a very strong disconnect, and I used to think it was just the denying of her body. She absolutely didn't identify as female with any of the feminine wiles, she would call them, but the feminine attributes. You know, she didn't wear makeup, and she didn't wear she wore her hair very short, like shorn like a boy's, from the time she got married until she died. So she had the exact same haircut my entire life. And that's just an interesting detail. And I know, I'm sure she's not the only woman who's done that, but I think that that is unusual. And that tends to be a more male trait. And so it feels to me that she really wanted to suppress the parts of her that other people could identify as female, not just the parts of hers that she identified herself.
Yeah, so it kind of begs the question, you know, was this a result of being in this environment, or was part of that her nature? Was part of that her, you know, her patterns that she came into this world with, and that's part of what drew her to marry someone who, you know, was she related to your grandfather, or was it your dad who was related to your grandfather?
She's the daughter of my grandfather.
Oh, okay. Well, then there you go. Like, it is definitely something that she was conditioned into in part, right?
Absolutely. She had 3 older brothers, and she was very much raised in a male culture at home. And then she married the like most toxic masculine man who was probably around. He was the tallest, he was the biggest, he was the most the highlight of the physical qualities that my grandfather most admired. Now, he didn't want my mother to marry my father at the beginning, and they were well in their 20s. My mom was 24, my dad was almost 30 when they decided to get married, and they weren't allowed to date. But my sister was just telling me a story that my father had told her, that my grandfather didn't think that he was good enough to be married into the family. He was very clear about that. And my mother just said, you know, this is what God wants from me. And he said no. And then her mother, his wife, said, you know, she's going to be an old maid. Like, she's, you know, because of that era in the 60s, 24 was pretty old for not having ever, you know, been with a boy in any way. And so it was my grandfather who listened to my grandmother and just said, all right, then she can go ahead and get married. So it was definitely something that was not, there was no, I don't know, softness about the marriage, and there was no softness about the family. That was something that my father was always trying to prove himself to his father-in-law. And he was always trying to prove himself to the organization that he was good enough to be married into it.
You know, it's interesting because you've used this proving yourself thing multiple times now. And I feel like that's a theme in the book. That's a really strong theme that you experience, that many other people are experiencing, that we don't innately have this worth, that like there's some part of us that's perhaps innately broken as like the premise, and that we need to prove ourselves, that we need to be saved, that we need to, you know, work hard so that we're valuable. And that comes up a lot with your mentality in the book. And I think that's like I said, a broad theme that goes on within this cult, is that you have to earn respect, right? Which is a very different idea than, say, other, the religious philosophies out there that say simply by existing, you are innately valuable, right? Would you say a little bit about that?
Well, you've said it very well yourself, quite honestly. I think that it is very endemic in our Western culture to prove ourselves and prove our value through our production. So through making money, through contributing to the economic machine, not only of our families, but of our communities and our particular country. And I think that in our family, while we weren't as interested in actual money, we were very interested in being the light of the world and being the leaders of the world and being capable. And I think it is a form of productivity. And I definitely think that many people that I have met, and maybe I'm drawn to people who see the world this way, but it is something that I have worked with many people who are trying to overcome that part of themselves that feels unworthy, that feels broken, that feels that they have spent sometimes decades really just trying to prove to themselves that they're enough.
Yes. And isn't that a fascinating thing? Because what if this premise that we're not enough isn't true, right? And instead, maybe it's true that we all have innate value simply by existing. But if you're caught in the idea that you're not valuable, you're never gonna like achieve, because it doesn't exist, actually. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't really exist, that thing that you're trying to prove, because it's already there. So it's almost like moot, but it's exhaustive to keep trying to prove it over and over, because you'll always have to if you think that you need to. You know what I'm saying? It's cyclical.
It's an illusion. I mean, it's really ephemeral. And you are chasing something you will never actually be able to contain. You will never capture it. Yeah.
Right.
It's inside. It's already there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that must be part of what, has been so healing for you in practicing yoga and in getting in touch with Eastern philosophies, philosophies that, I mean, in a lot of Buddhism, they even are like, into animism, where they believe even objects and like our material reality, they all have energy and they all have chi and they all have value, so of course, why wouldn't like a living person or a dog or a plant, that has like a life force flowing through them also be sacred, right?
Absolutely. And this question of pronouns, but extending that to the animal kingdom, to the fauna, to this idea that we would have more respect for all living things if we didn't put ourselves at the center of the universe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well said. I think you explore that quite a bit in the book with the way that you connect with plants.
Yes. And I do think that, speaking of yoga, I mean, for me, coming to yoga, I did not practice yoga when I was young. I came to yoga in my 30s, and I believed I was very broken, but my body did feel very broken. I was in pain. My back was in pain. I had given birth to children in my 20s, a lot of children, and I just hadn't taken care of myself since then. And I was just busy taking care of everyone else. I'd been teaching college for years at that point. I had been raising the children, and I had also been really trying to maintain the physical aspect of the home, just like doing the work of maintaining community and dishes and, cleaning and all of those things. So when I came to yoga, it was really just as a physical practice to heal my back. And I think many people come to the practice from that mindset, and then they find that other parts of themselves start opening up. So I've told this story in writing, but the short version is I could not stay in Shavasana for literally years when I started practicing yoga. I started practicing at LA Fitness. I just practiced at a gym once a week, and a yoga teacher who now teaches with me at the yoga studio, she would start Shavasana, and I would just tell her that I had to leave early. I think I told her the first time and then just never mentioned it again. I just roll up my mat and leave before anybody went into Shavasana. And I just couldn't imagine lying still. I really didn't think I had the time in my life to do that. And I think Shavasana at the gym, it was a 1 hour class, was probably 3 minutes, but I couldn't be bothered to slow down for 3 minutes. And the very first time I did it, and I really stayed for that Shavasana, it was so much worse than I thought. I just started crying. I went to the car, I was crying, I couldn't drive. It was so emotional for me to sit in silence for 3 minutes. And I just never done it. You know, I hadn't done it since I'd been like abandoned in the hospital. And I did call my mom, and I wanted to talk to her about some things about our childhood, and she didn't want to talk about it. But it just was the opening of me saying, okay, there's something here that does need to be healed. It may not be broken, but it needs to be addressed. And it led me much deeper into the yoga practice. And I had a personal tragedy not too much later than that, and it prompted me to think I should take my yoga practice more seriously. And I committed for a couple of years and then joined a teacher training program while in my 30s that would give me the opportunity to dive deeper into the practice, not because I wanted to teach it, but because I wanted to understand it. And then in the process of doing that, of course, as you said about yourself, you know, you go somewhere and you don't want to be a teacher, but you are a teacher. You know, like I was already a teacher in other places of my life. So our lead instructor had me start teaching before I even finished the program. And he just said, you need to do this. I need you to do this. And so, of course, we often teach best what we most need to learn. And for me, teaching yoga has been a way to really commit to understanding a practice and to meditating, to Eastern philosophy. And it's really difficult to teach something that you don't understand. So I just continue to go deeper and to understand, because there's always more to know. And it's not that we need to know it in order to practice, but the more that we learn, I think the more that we understand about ourselves and the more we accept ourselves fully and the people who come to us.
Yeah, well, I think that for me, teaching yoga became an extension of my own practice of yoga, because you start to see yourself in your students, you know, in the ones that are struggling or having a hard time. It reminds you of those moments where you cried on your mat or where you were not able to stay in Savasana, and you feel so much compassion for them. And it's opening up more compassion towards yourself, ultimately, for the times when you're not having a good day on the mat or a good day in general. You know, it's such a compassionate thing to be helping others, especially with their bodies, which is a very intimate realm. And so it definitely feels like it was a natural progression for you in your healing process to get to a space where you were sharing with others and in that way, and opening that door to having some level of authority in this practice, like inviting yourself into a position of authority, like with curiosity. It sounds like you didn't wait to be ready. You just stepped in and started doing it. And it's quite interesting what you said before, because you're in motion a lot in the book. You're going. I think in the hospital, it really, you know, those times when you're in the hospital in the book are one of the only times that you're not in motion. You're not moving.
Yes. And I think because those were such painful times, I did not associate rest with peace. I associated rest with suffering. There was a lot of physical pain at the time, but there was also a lot of emotional pain in terms of alienation. But I loved what you said about compassion. It does flow both ways. As you give it, you also receive it, not necessarily from someone, but toward yourself, because yes, we are all connected. So in giving compassion, you are just widening that space inside yourself. And I think that when I was in the hospital, I did not understand compassion. I didn't know how to offer that to myself as someone who needed healing. I thought of myself as someone, I was ashamed, because that's how my family felt about me. And my family, meaning my whole extended family from the cult, that it was a way of God punishing me, being sick, and punishing the community I came from for somebody doing something wrong, whether that was me or someone else, depending on whose interpretation. But when you think about illness as a form of punishment, instead of possibly an indication that there's something that needs to be healed or addressed inside of your body, and when you don't have the awareness that the mind-body connection is not, that there is no separation, that they are fully integrated, it's really difficult, if you believe they're separate, to not suppress whatever it is that your body is trying to tell you.
Yes, I was thinking about this earlier, you know, this concept of mind over matter. And we've heard that so many times that I've started going like, what about matter over mind? Is that make sense? And I'm like, no, not quite. It's like they're the same. Like it's like they're integrated. Mind is matter, matter is mind. So there's not a hierarchy there. But when we think that we can control our bodies, for example, with our minds, then that opens the door to like other people being able to control our bodies, or that God can control our bodies versus, I guess a more integrated view would say that our bodies are part of God. our bodies are part of the control that we experience or don't experience, and that they're not separate from each other, right? So we open kind of a whole box of, I guess, trouble when we think that they're separate, because then now there's this space for other people to come in and decide what happens in your body for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one way, there's so many different ways to visualize this, but to think that the spiritual matter, whatever spiritual entity, the chi, the om, the life force, that the prana in all of us, that our body is just a vehicle through which we are experiencing that. And it is during our lifetimes, this vehicle that we are moving through space, but it is whatever it is that unites and ignites us all, flows through all of us at all times. And we share it through our breath, through the inhale and the exhale, and the air that we literally share, not only with other human beings, but with all the plants that literally provide the oxygen as we provide the CO2, and that we are in relationship. And that there is truly an interdependency on this planet, that we like to think, and when I say we, I mean as a species, we behave as if we are dominant, without understanding sometimes that we are interdependent.
Absolutely. Even all the cool gadgets and stuff we've created have come from minerals in the earth. They have come from this planet. And we, yes, have been clever and, built them in some way. But why have we been clever? Because we've been nourished by food that also comes from the earth, whether it's, animals eating grass and we're eating the animals or whatever, you know what I mean? It's all been, given to us in so many ways. And then we've created and given back in whatever way we have, whether it's been a positive or a negative giving back, right? And then it moves through again. So you're absolutely right. I can see that so clearly. And also in the way that in your book, you are experiencing the disconnection. And I feel like in listening to you talking about, and not just talking about, but like evoking the disconnection with stating these really strong like value statements about yourself, about your body, about how the world works, like it's just your reality. It does something to the listener to hear those statements, because I hear it and I go, no. I hear it and I go, oh. I hear it and I have some response to it that basically invites me into challenging that like belief that you were holding, because I feel that's not true. So I thought it was a really interesting technique, because there's many ways to write a memoir, obviously, and not everybody chooses to channel their former selves. Sometimes people are writing with this higher perspective of like who they are now, looking back on that and, taking it apart. But you really take us there. You take us there, and it's still very effective in showing you, the opposite of what you're saying. It's showing us that there's a different way, and you do it through showing us the thing that doesn't work.
That's a wonderful way to put it. And yes, it was very intentional to take the reader or the listener on an experience with me, because at the time I could only see the aspects that were told or shown to me, and I did not have all the pieces. I certainly didn't have outside knowledge, but I also didn't have knowledge of myself. And I think most of us have gone through periods of time where we are working with very fragmented aspects of reality. They might be true, but they're only one piece of something much larger. And I would imagine that we are still working with only pieces of a much larger picture that we are unable to fully envision. But knowing that can help us understand the place that we are right now as being on a journey. When a little bit of cliche here, but you know, that it's not, that is the journey, not the destination, right? That is our experience, and that we are just on this part of the path, and that it will open up. And just as we may be more enlightened than we were 10 years ago, hopefully we can look back and cringe a little at our former selves, that there will be a time that we are more enlightened than we are now. And yeah, so just appreciating where we are in any given moment, and then also reminding ourselves that we don't have all the answers. And I loved being back, and that girl, it was difficult to be back inside of her, but also knowing that she was looking for answers that she didn't yet have. And I think that it is okay to sit in the questions now as well. I don't know all the answers now. I feel that I know more than I did then, but I'm still, you know, a product of a human on this planet that is influenced by all sorts of factors, and many of which are unformed and unavailable to me at present.
Yes. And I think that even in the way that you kind of close, and, you know, because then, you know, towards the end of the book, I won't spoil it for anybody, but you're a grown up, you're an adult, and you kind of give us like a little bit of like a, what's it called at the end, like the last part where there's the epilogue. Yes. Where you kind of give us like this window into like what happened next. Right. And even then, you don't really do any of the cliche things where you're like summing it up, where you're like saying these like grand finale kinds of things. Like you just kind of allow what happened to be, and for the reader to feel into it. You're not you're nudging us, but you're not like pointing us in the full direction of like a thesis, for example. Do you know what I mean? And I actually really appreciated that, because it felt like an opening to a dialogue. It felt like now I was ready to have like a conversation about what I heard. It wasn't all spelled out for me. It wasn't all like, you know, tied up in with a little bow at the end. And I like that. It felt like you could write another book and there would be like a lot of space to play with.
Absolutely. There's a lot of space left to play with. But, you know, when I think of being at my highest self at any point right now, like in any moment that I'm feeling that I'm most in sync with myself, it is in a space of openness and questions and conversation, a conversation with myself, or a conversation with spirit, a conversation with another person, especially a person who disagrees, who has a different perspective. I think one of the greatest gifts we can give anyone is to expand their minds. And in so doing, we expand our own minds. As to be able to listen to anyone who has a different perspective always expands us if we allow it to. And so if someone has a very different experience than I have, but I leave space for a conversation, then they don't need to defend themselves, and they don't need to prove me wrong. They can just open themselves to the possibility that I know I'm wrong, or that, you know, that I don't have all the answers, and that they might not either. And that we have all been led to believe things that might not be true.
And this seems like probably a blossom of the flower of your, or the seed of your experience of growing up with a closed construct, and then breaking out of that, and in a continuous process, it seems, of discovery, you know, discovering and learning. And as you said, like in conversation with people and with your environment and with spirit. And so that sense of openness and your kind of willingness to go there and to have like the slightly confrontational conversations, or maybe majorly confrontational conversations, it sounds like that's like a huge gift that came from growing up with such a limited viewpoint at your disposal. I think, you know, would you say a little bit about some of, like, you've gotten some really positive responses from this book, and then you've also gotten naysayers or people that are not really comfortable with what you've been writing about. Would you talk a little bit about that dynamic?
Well, one of the most unexpected gifts that I've received since the book has come out is a lot of communication in various forms from people that I either knew very briefly when I was super young, like some of them I have memories of, but I was maybe 3 or 4 or 5. There's people who were around my grandfather before I was born, knew my mom when she was pregnant with me. Women who had been young, they were girls at the time, they took care of me as a baby because my mother did not. And they have come out of the woodworks, and I've even taken the time to show up and meet them for coffee, and I hadn't seen them since I was a child. beautiful opportunities to talk about their experience in a different place in the cult than I was. And that has been also very healing, not only because I can also hold space for their stories, but because through their pain, I'm also I at least apparently have given them a little bit of language to understand some of their own journey that they have very frequently repressed, that they experienced a great deal of pain when they were excommunicated, and then put it on a shelf somewhere and hadn't really come back to process. So that has been wonderfully healing. Then there has been the people, I would say that I have not received any negative reaction from anyone who used to be in the cult, but the people who are still there, who have devoted their lives, including my sister, my older sister, who is, I call Elizabeth in the book. She is running a school there, and she basically serves the same position that our mother did. And she's calling me a liar, and she says that I have ill will, and my father thinks that by calling it a cult that I have committed heresy and I have destroyed the integrity of our family. So my father's not speaking to me and my sister's not speaking to me. But my younger siblings are very much not only supporting the story, but grateful that we're having this conversation. And they left within a few years of me leaving. My sister a couple years later, my brother probably only 3 years after I left. So they have had a journey on their own, but because we were raised in such a strict environment and we were pitted against each other, we did not go on the same journey after we left. All four of us went in different directions, and there has not been much of a family to come back to. And so it has opened up new conversations and old conversations with my younger siblings, which has been beautiful. And then there are people on the outside who perhaps are very religious or exist in what I would call high control groups or very close communities, maybe both, who don't like that I'm questioning systems and hierarchies that they believe are useful for young people. Also, people who've said things that I now find interesting, was a little painful at the very beginning, where they say, well, that's not possible. CPS, Child Protective Services would have been called, or this would have been happened. Nobody's allowed to stay alone at the hospital. You're lying about that. And I just talked to a woman who was in a book club recently, and she said, I was in the hospital in the 80s, and my mom had other children, and of course she wasn't in the hospital. I was left for long periods of time, which, by the way, I do not think was that uncommon. Maybe the degree to which I was left was a little uncommon, but it was not uncommon for families to not be able to just hang out in a hospital. There wasn't, my mom had other children, she had a job, we lived very, very far from the hospital. I think that many people believed in the 80s and that in the early 80s, there was a lot of latchkey kids to begin with, but they believed that you were safe in a hospital and that your parents were doing the right things leaving you there. And it was really a matter of finances, which ours was covered by Ronald McDonald House, but there was no crime in being poor. And I don't think that anybody at a hospital would have asked the kinds of questions that we might ask now, which is what is happening at home, because I wasn't at home. They weren't doing household visits. So it wasn't like they were looking at the community. And I don't think they asked children questions about what it was like at home. They asked you how you felt that day. And did you, you checked your vitals, and they took a lot of blood. I had blood tests taken maybe 10 times a day. I was just constantly at the mercy of their experiments on me. There was a lot of doctors and residents, student doctors coming in, learning because they didn't understand my condition. And I just don't think that, I think that it's really easy now to think that with the different style of parenting, that it is abuse to neglect your child in a hospital. And while I do think it probably is emotionally abusive, I do not think it was considered emotionally abusive at the time by most people. And certainly the medical professionals did not know what was going on prior to me ending up in the hospital or after I left. And again, why would they know that? And they're very busy trying to save lives. Their job is not to psychoanalyze the patients. That just wasn't what took place in the hospital. So there definitely have been people who have challenged that part of the story, or challenged just the fact that I perhaps betrayed my family that is not kind of like people say about Prince Harry, which I know is a different story, but the degree to which you do or don't have the right to call out your family on things that you find unacceptable.
Right. Well, and that's why I think that it's really brave what you've done, and really powerful, actually, because to be able to stand up and tell the truth, even though you're going to get some backlash, or people questioning your story, like that is a powerful thing to do, because it opens up space inside you, and it looks like it's opened up space inside, all of your family, even the ones that didn't want that space opened up. They had some space opened up where, they may be upset about it, but they're perhaps starting to question things. Who knows? Maybe one day they'll read the book, who knows, just to find out what you said, and the piece about the hospital, and it's not like you were 3. I think especially in like the 80s, there was this attitude of like, once your kid is like 7 or 8, like they're pretty much fine. And I mean, even in the 90s, I grew up in the 90s, like I, remember being like home alone at like 8 with my brother when he was like 6, like while my mom ran to the store, like that was normal, and when I wanted to like walk down to, the park or something at 8, my mother was fine with that, So I think it's a different world, and I didn't even question that. Growing up in the 90s, for me, I didn't even question that. I thought that it seemed sad to me. It seemed sad, but it didn't seem unbelievable at all. So I'm surprised to hear that there's people who are thinking that that's a dramatization or something.
Yeah, I assume that they might either be of a different age, or for whatever reason, their family didn't treat them that way, because there certainly were at any of these ages women who were home full time, and those women might have been hypervigilant. And if you had an only child and you were a mom home, and in my family, women were always working. So like my dad's mom, who was working in a factory and basically allowed her son to go to a cult. She was a single mom of an only child, and she was supporting herself and him on an 8th grade education. She didn't have any education. My other grandmother was working to support her, at the time, fairly crazy cult husband, who wasn't bringing any money when he was starting the cult, and she did all the work financially to support. So there's also, depending on how your family legacy has gone, if you've seen women who didn't work, you might think a woman's job was to protect her child during those times. But I don't think, even if I wasn't in a cult, that any of the women in my family were ever home taking care of their kids during any of those ages that I was. That just wasn't something in our family that was the experience, simply because nobody had the time to be there. That just wasn't, we did not have stay-at-home parents for generations. As far back as on either side of my family that anyone has ever recorded, there hasn't been those sorts of nuclear family dynamics.
That's so fascinating.
And there's a lot of families like that, but
yeah. Well, I mean, it's fascinating because there's a lot of different kinds of like extreme religious cults out there, and some of them have very defined roles for women that involve high levels of what we could call nurture, right? And they expect the women to have long hair, and they expect the women to, dress a certain way or be a certain way. And it's fascinating that in your environment, there was such a complete denial of femininity, like in an absolute kind of way, like not just, not just like the nurture part, or like having the women, be home with the kids, and, masculinized women, the short hair of your mother, and the level of work that was expected of them, but also like in the way that there's a denial of your body, and your body being anything more than like a vehicle for babies. I think at one point you put it like that in the book, or that your body being a tool to be used for labor, but definitely not something to be like beautified, right? Like there's a belief in the evil of beauty, actually, in the book that you touch on, which is super different than some of other, religious communities where they want women to be, feminine and long hair and beautiful and, all that stuff.
My mother directly vilified beauty. She was absolutely certain that to be good looking meant that you were of the devil, and that it was her job to make sure that we were not attractive. And that was something that was beat into me very young, is to not be attractive. And and so I think that was a different manifestation. My grandfather also, I was talking to a woman who her brother had been there. And it's interesting because I did not join. So there was never a time I wasn't there. But the people who were attracted to it, she was saying how her brother was taught by my grandfather over and over that sex is only for procreation. You never engage in sex unless you want to have a child. So you obviously have to be married, but you also have to be of the childbearing ages, and you have to be intending to produce children. And so I'm not saying that everybody observed that, because that was not spoken of, but it was definitely all sex for pleasure, any pleasure really. There was no pleasure in food, there was no pleasure in touch, there was no pleasure in, yes, beauty or comfort or music. I mean, anything. I mean, there might be music to praise God, but there was no entertainment. There just was no physical pleasures. And sure, we often associate that more with femininity, but I don't think the men were allowed pleasures either. There was no alcohol, there was no smoking, there was no, like, you couldn't ornate your body, you couldn't ornament in any way, you couldn't, obviously do tattoos, but you couldn't pierce your ears, you couldn't do things that would accentuate the temple that I think our bodies are. And men were taught to deny themselves too, and they were taught masturbation was a sin. So there was no, and actively taught. I think the girls were not actively taught that because nobody thought that a woman would ever think about that. I just don't think they thought about women receiving pleasure. But I think that for sure, the men I married a man who was there, and he was, he joined at 7, and he was adamantly taught that you should never masturbate your whole life. It was something very much shunned. And so you think about teenage boys who had to be kept so busy, and they had to be so exhausted, they'd be so tired all the time, and they were put in group environments and never allowed to touch themselves. We were all given 1 minute to shower. I was never given more than 60 seconds to spend in the shower. You weren't allowed to look at your own naked body. You weren't allowed to feel that you had to take cold showers. You weren't allowed to do anything that could bring you pleasure.
That's so fascinating. That's such a disturbing form of control, because it really keeps you separate from a huge part of your humanity. And I think it makes a person very vulnerable, because they are not able to feel a sense of belongingness even to their own body, right? Yeah. Like enjoying time. Yeah, sorry, say that again.
Very effective.
Yeah, it's very effective.
Mm-hmm. And so then the only source of belonging you can then have is from the group, and you're completely reliant upon the group's protections of you because you're so vulnerable. And then if you question anything, you are excommunicated and no one's allowed to ever speak to you again. You're completely outside of everyone you know. That becomes then a very big threat. It's not kind of like, oh, I'm going to lose my friends. You're losing everyone and everything that you belong to, and you don't belong to yourself, so you have nothing.
Yeah, wow, it's quite scary, quite insidious. And the fact that these boys were joining at such a young age, like 7, that's really young, or even as teenagers, we're so impressionable, and we're not experienced in the world. It's not like you had a whole lot of like older people joining. You mostly seemed like the younger people were joining.
No one was allowed to join as an adult. That wasn't possible. So it was a sports organization for children. Most people who stayed joined by age 5. So you and your parents didn't join, just the kids joined. And then you would be groomed up into the place where at 14, you could not any longer, you weren't, at the beginning, you could go to school. Like you might be a normal kid who was just brought for an after school program, and then you'd spend the weekends there. And then as you get older, you have to commit more and more time. And then by the time you're 14, you are not allowed to go to school anymore. You have to be completely there. And then when you're 18, you sign commitment for life. But you can't get to the point of being an 18-year-old who signs a commitment for life form if you hadn't been groomed all throughout. Right. I personally don't know anyone who stayed there, who became a leader there, who wasn't there by the age of 6 or 7. The boy that I talk about in the book, whose name is Luke, he joined the organization at 6 years old. The man I married joined at 7. These boys and these men were there from just, and they had single moms, or they had, just in situations where they needed somewhere to be. And then they were groomed up in this very specific way. The boys were trained to be brutal to each other and to girls. And if you weren't willing to do that or couldn't do that, or your family didn't like what you were becoming, either the family pulled you out or you pulled yourself out at very young ages. So maybe you wouldn't have been very hurt by the organization. It's only the people who bought into the system who continued to be there and to continue to get the indoctrination, the mind control, which is really insidious. So there were families who pulled out their kids at ages 11 or 12 because they were like, this is too much, like whatever, this is like, there's something wrong with this place. And while the organization didn't ever tell the truth about it, what it was, you weren't allowed to talk to your parents. There were parents, of course. There's about 1,500 kids and only like 150 at the inner part. So, 9 out of 10 boys were pulled out before the ages of 10 or 11, 90%. So it was really the only, like the whole program was like a pyramid to get to the point where you have the boys who weren't pulled out. Kind of in some ways, like the Catholic Church, like the altar boys, or like it's only those boys who were vulnerable who were the victims of the priest. So it's not like every boy who was part of the Catholic Church ended up being hurt by a priest, but the boys who were already so vulnerable. And that's pretty much how this organization worked as well.
Wow, that's pretty intense. I mean, the not belonging to oneself and like the harrowing journey of trying to come out of that, right? You would probably just want to stay in this environment, because how to come back from all of this conditioning that says that your body is evil, that pleasure is wrong, right? And that you have basically guilt and shame every time you enjoy yourself or you enjoy your body. Like, it would be impossible to live in the regular world. And so
and it took me a very, very long time to live in the regular world. And my sister, who's lived there her whole life, she can't wrap her head around that this could possibly have been my experience. I don't know how much of the book she read, but the part, I know she read some. And I know my father, he said out loud to me when I tried to help prepare him months before the book came out, Dad, I'm working on this book. It's going to be uncomfortable. We can talk about it. I tried to have all those conversations with him. And once he just thought maybe nobody would read it. But once it was getting a little closer, I said, Dad, it's possible that people will read this. So we should talk about it. And he said, well, I'm not going to read it. I'm going to have, and he mentioned the head of the organization, he'll read it and he'll tell me what to think. At the end of the day, he didn't read it either. And he just told my dad to not talk about it, not think about it. It doesn't matter. It's not true. It's a lie. And I didn't name the organization directly, although anyone who's ever been a part knows. And if you do a little bit of Googling, you can figure it out. But they don't want to draw attention to it because they don't want people to think that it's them. But my sister really, truly, I think, believes that those things couldn't have happened to me because they didn't happen to her. And I feel that her story is different than mine because she never got excommunicated. So she didn't experience those kinds of, like, that kind of annihilation of having, she still believes everything we were taught, and she still carries all of that. She hasn't ever unpacked it. So of course she thinks I must be at least exaggerating at the very least, because she thinks, well, nothing bad ever happened to me. How could these bad things happen to you? For example, she said, well, our dad didn't hit me, she said. And I said, I don't know if that's true. That does not seem true to me. When I sat down and met with her, our younger brother read the book in one night. He hasn't read a book since he was a teenager, never went to college, didn't do any of that. And he got the book from Amazon. He read it. He showed up at my house. He said, did you know Dad used to come into my room and punch me in the face? And he started telling me these things. He said, I never told you that. I didn't know what was happening to you. I didn't know what happened to our sister. I didn't, and it was just things we didn't talk about because we were isolated from each other. So of course we didn't talk about it. We were shamed. We thought we were the bad one. I thought I was the bad one. My brother thought he was the bad one. My younger sister thought she was the bad one, but our older sister was always treated like the good one. So I don't think these things did happen to her, and I can allow for her having a completely different experience. Now, it would be surprise me if our father never hit her, but it's possible. It's possible that maybe she was sort of the example of what it means to be a good child, and she was upheld as do this or else. It's hard for me to say, but it's not, her story is not mine to tell,
Right. And just because she wasn't hit and you were, it doesn't change that much, really. It doesn't change that much about the book or about the truth. It doesn't make it, to me, it doesn't make your story any less believable that she had a different experience. So,
Absolutely. And I did ask her when I sat down with her before the book came out, I said, you do remember hitting me, right? Like, you hit me a lot. And she said, oh yeah, but kids do that. I said, where do you think you learned that? And then she didn't even know how to answer that question. I was like, I mean, maybe you weren't, but you must have witnessed that because you were very physically violent. And she said, well, you deserved it. I said, okay, maybe. I mean, I'm sure I was annoying. That's not the point. The point is, do you ever remember me hitting you back? And she said, no. She could actually articulate that. I said, so where did you learn that it was okay to hit your younger sister on a regular basis? Like, where did you learn that? So I don't know, I feel like most parents would tell you not to do that as an older sister, right?
Right. Well, and if you internalized that when I'm hit, it's because I deserve it, it almost like makes the hitting invisible.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, I deserved that. That's, like I accept it. And it's only when we feel like it's unjust, there's a little part of us that's like, I didn't deserve that. Why did that happen to me? I'm hurt. I'm upset about it. That it becomes this bigger deal. It becomes like this thing that we remember versus like just part of the landscape of like what I got because, X, Y, and Z. It's like you have this very linear, like I did this, I got hit and I deserved it. It almost like becomes invisible, like I said before.
And that happened to me in my adult life when I was victims of domestic violence. And I just truly just didn't really question it. And it wasn't until I got beat up pretty bad with broken bones that I went to a therapist and really started to have to ask myself, why is this happening to me? I mean, I didn't believe I deserved it, but I was like, this isn't happening to other women that I know, who are professionals, who are, like, I don't know why this is happening to me. And I had to then really do the work to realize that I wasn't intentionally putting myself in these positions, but I just didn't think that I was perhaps worthy of respect, even as a fully grown adult after I had children. And, I was just used to it. And I just hadn't really unpacked all that yet.
Yes. And it's fascinating, this idea of habituation in our nervous system, because I think of that when you're speaking of this, like we get used to what we're used to. And then when we're around someone and somebody else who doesn't have our same like trauma and history will be like, ooh, red flag, red flag, red flag. But we're like habituating those things. That's normal. That kind of behavior is like, it's like whatever. It's just how life is. It's just how men are. It's just how people are, and then the things happen and we're blindsided. We didn't see it coming because we were unconsciously like attracting that. It's not even much like attracting that. We're just used to it. Like you said before, we're just like our nervous system has become aligned with that. And so we don't notice and move our bodies out of the way of the danger in the time that, we should. Our timing with it is off. We probably figure that out, after it's already happened, or even a month or a year or 2 years after it already happened, as we shift into a different perception, right?
We don't know how to move ourselves out of the way. I love how you said that. Like not only this, but of unkind words or of maybe even being asked or required to do work that is not just. And we might just not question it. And we might just continue to work ourselves past the point of not only comfort, but we might put our own health in jeopardy because we don't move ourselves away from the expectations that our bodies do not belong to us.
Yes. Getting kind of deeper into that concept that is so much part of your experience as a child and in this book, the vilification of beauty, the way that you are not connected to your body is not your friend, it's your foe in very many ways, and you're really fighting your own physical development as you grow into womanhood. And then kind of flashing forward to like the woman that you are now and where you've arrived. Tell us a little bit about what it's been like to slowly come back into your body. I mean, through yoga, but what other things have also helped you? Obviously therapy.
I think all the somatic experiences have been far more important to my healing process than cognitive therapy. I did do cognitive therapy, but if I had not been supplementing it with kinesthetic and somatic practices, I don't know that my body would have shifted its nervous system and its awareness. So, and I have many reasons to believe that. But when I first went to college, I I had an eating disorder. I was bulimic. I was anorexic prior, but I was bulimic. I didn't have the language for that. And I saw a poster that talked about if you are throwing up, if you're doing, and it was really early on in the 80s where it was becoming just barely part of, I think, contemporary dialogue, like public dialogue. And I saw this flyer and I thought, ooh, I do that. And I didn't even know that it was a problem that I did it. And so I went to the workshop, and I remember one of the things that scared me is that all the vomiting could be corrupting my teeth. And I hadn't had dental care, and I had pretty nice teeth without having dental care. And I kind of felt very grateful for that. And I thought, if I'm destroying my teeth and I don't have the money to fix them, that could be a problem. So I was just like listening to things. I thought, oh, maybe this isn't healthy. And I didn't go to group therapy or go to a therapist, but I did listen to all the suggestions. And then I wrote them down and I put myself on a regimen. And I stopped eating everything except for one food. And then I would add a second food. So I started on plain yogurt, plain non-fat yogurt. And that's the only thing I would allow myself to eat because I wouldn't throw it up. It was just something that settled well in my body. And then I added just a little bit of sunflower seeds. And so I would eat, plain yogurt and sunflower seeds. And I would just so that I would never overeat. I couldn't, and I would just bring myself back into the awareness of what food was for, nutrition. And I started thinking about trying to find, and I was eating out of the cafeteria at school, at the dining hall at the time. So I had access to whatever foods they had there, and I didn't have to go buy it. I'd never been to a grocery store. Wasn't raised going to grocery stores. We were just eating off the land, or we had government surplus things that were dropped off. So I just didn't have the experience of knowing how to really ever make choices about what to feed myself. And that has been something that I think I struggle with, honestly, to this day, to some extent. But it was a very good practice for me to start finding out ways to, and I stopped. And I did not have an active eating disorder after that. My daughter has mentioned to me, she's a marriage and family therapist who's done a lot of work. She specializes in disordered eating and working with body image. And she would say to me as an adult, when she's an adult, that she thought perhaps I still had disordered eating, even though I did not think I had eating disorders. I certainly wasn't throwing up and I wasn't starving myself, but she would point out to me often when you had a great deal of stress, you would all of a sudden get really thin, and I never dieted. And I thought, like, I'm making good choices for myself, but I would sometimes just lose a lot of weight because I wasn't eating because I was so stressed. And then she said, and also you would over exercise when you got stressed. And so she was noticing that she didn't think I demonstrated healthy behaviors towards food. And I think that she's right, but I don't think I understood that at the time. So I think this process of recognizing that it is a journey, and that I thought I was better. I mean, I was better than I used to be, but I thought I was healed in that area of my life. And now I understand that also not receiving pleasure out of food was also a problem, that I wasn't. Yeah. And I didn't know how to balance those things inside my body. And that has been a journey that I have been more committed to in the last 5 years. And I think that through my yoga practice, I learned to see exercise as not something that was just to punish my body or to dominate it, to work off calories or to make myself strong. I think yoga can help you be strong, but it also helps you be flexible and also helps you to listen to your body. And I was exercising in ways that helped me override my body, like to run past the point of pain. And then what you learn from that is pain, you can override pain. You don't need to listen to your body when it gives you pain, which is something they legitimately teach. Like if you're running a marathon, that you work past the pain, right? Like it's not like you stop when your body's in pain. You learn to override that pain. And so yoga helped me understand that was, and for a great deal of time, I stopped exercising except for yoga so that I could listen to my body. And that has been very healing. And then I also think that making better choices for myself in terms of all my relationships, not just romantic relationships, but relationships with people who are also on healing journeys, people who are willing to be mutual in the relationship, to not just dump all of their problems on me, for example, or to expect me to be available on their schedule and or just available because they need something. That was very normal for me. I think I spent most of my adult life, partly also as a teacher, as a mother. My friendships were just based on other people's need of me. And I think I really convinced myself that I was a good person because I was meeting people's needs, and that made me a good friend. And I prided myself in that. And it took me a very long time to recognize that how authentic is a friendship if I'm doing things I don't want all the time, you know, and that I'm not actually being authentic with these people who are engaging with me by even having needs or expressing them or asking for what I want or even setting the boundary of saying no. And that is, I think, a direct consequence of being raised the way I was, that it took me a very long time to recognize that I had the right to also create boundaries on my time and with my emotions.
Yes, and boundaries aren't just, the communication that we have and the, letting people know, oh, I'm actually not available right now. Oh, I know you need this from me, but creating that boundary, like we think of it kind of as an energetic thing. But what you touched on just a moment ago is that our boundaries are also very physical, in that this is the limit for my body right now, today, in this moment, right? And I'm not going to push past that and override my own boundary that I'm sensing and experiencing in my body, which, many years ago, I asked one of my somatic mentors about, why is it that people do this? Like, why is it that I did this? Why is it that we push beyond where we're comfortable and we do it intensely and we do it over and over, like in exercise or in fitness or, like you said, run a marathon or whatnot? Why do we override our body if it creates this disconnection to our body? And she said, well, it's incredibly useful if you're going to war. And I was like, oh, I see. Like, if you are going to be putting yourself in a war zone and you're going to be killing other people and having people, stabbing you or whatever, like, of course you don't want to be connected to your body because your body's going to say, get the fuck out of there. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. So there's like an armoring. There's like a, process of building up these barriers. But it's funny because we think of an armor as a boundary, but what it ends up doing is that we don't know where our boundaries are. We don't know where our actual boundaries are in our body because everything's just walled off, right? So yeah, growing up it's like you grew up being prepared for war of some kind.
Oh, we were taught we were in the army of God, and it was very much war language. We were singing war hymns, and yes, the boundary of not knowing. I didn't know where my body was. I only knew all the barriers that we were putting up between ourselves and the enemy, which was everyone in the outside world. And it's that you put that beautifully. So bringing this around to the healing of that, I think that there are many of us, maybe not in quite as extreme situations as I was in, but who don't feel that we have the right or even the knowledge of how to listen to what our body actually needs or wants. Like it's just a language we can't hear. It's like or we don't understand it. And so I believe that yoga is one of the somatic practices, and there are more. I can now sit in meditation, and it's something I teach, especially with my teacher trainers, and I've gone a little bit deeper even in teaching that in the last couple of years since COVID, because so many people have had to be with themselves. And so the practice of meditation is a way of finding pleasure in that instead of, at least that is my intent in teaching it, and is for everyone who practices with me to find pleasure in the act and to modify it as many times as necessary so that they can find the place where they're nourishing themselves through the act of meditation, that they're not doing it to prove something to somebody or to override anything, but that they're doing it as a way to not only listen to themselves, but to fully be present in the luxury of the beauty of themselves. And that is one practice. It's a somatic practice as well. But even things like walking, and being present in nature and walking with the intent to be present with the environment, to walk sometimes without headphones, to walk, and also to share community with other people and to decide who you want that community to be. That I think can also be a somatic practice. Like, who energetically do you allow into your space, into your headspace, into your, physical proximity? And there are so many practices that I have come to that have helped me recognize that this interdependence of community can be itself healing.
Yes. And, somatic practice can be anything if you're experiencing yourself and your body and you're allowing the feedback to land and arrive in your body. When you're connected, living is a somatic experience. I mean, I personally feel that that's the true nature of our experience, is this this broadness is all of the scope. You know, that's why this podcast can really cover like all these different subjects, because being being a somatic being, is being human. And it's when we start to get chopped up and compartmentalized and we start blocking off these parts of ourselves that we're not living somatically. We're living in denial of pleasure. We're living in denial of a whole part of our human experience, which is the sensation of being alive, which is the sunlight on our skin and the joy of that, and the joy of eating when you're hungry and sleeping when you're tired, and you know, enjoying being.
Enjoying being. Yes. Enjoying being. That is not something that I could even imagine a couple of decades ago. And now to be in my body is to enjoy being.
Yeah. Well, it's such an amazing book that you've written. I highly recommend to our listeners to get the audiobook if you want to hear Michelle speak it, which is really powerful. You can also find the book on Amazon. Is there something more that you want to say? Like, the last piece I'd like to add here is a little bit, we touched on this, I think, through text messages, how many young women have reached out to you because they have felt that the purity culture stuff that you dealt with, like they can relate to it, like they were impacted by it, whether it's growing up in a religious family or some other kind of situation. Would you speak a little bit about the women who've reached out to you and that conversation?
Yeah, so that has been very interesting. We were not, my publisher did not specifically think that young readers were the audience. I actually thought it might appeal to young readers, but they were like, no, it's going to be people who've already really had time to process their own lives, who are going to be interested in thinking about how they became who they are. And in my experience so far, as far as people who are writing to me who are strangers, it has been predominantly young women and women between the ages of 18 and 25. And they are expressing various parts of saying that they have disordered eating or eating disorders, that they were taught to hate their bodies, that they were taught that their bodies belonged to their future husbands. And for example, one young woman was in a particular community, a religious community, where she was asked to read these letters that the boys in her community had written. And the boys had all written letters to anonymous girls, to the girls as a group or whatever, but dear future wife, thank you for keeping yourself pure for me. Thank you for understanding that I don't want used goods. Thank you for respecting your body, etc. But in their own language of like, thank you for respecting me by keeping your body pure. And then she said they were required to write letters to their future husband to say, I am saving my body for you. And how she thought about how it was inculcated into her that her body was not for her own pleasure. Her body was for the service of a future husband, not for someone she knew, but for someone she may someday know, right? And that she was not protecting her body for her own growth, her own emotional respect for herself. It wasn't that. And so she said she really identified with how you don't see your body as yourself, you know, that you're taught to separate yourself, that your mind and body, but basically that your spirit or your soul is separate from your body, but that your body, this purity thing, you must maintain purity, which really means that you can't defile it by letting anyone touch you. And that the whole cult of virginity too, this idea that then when you give yourself to your husband, which by the way, many of these girls had horrible experiences in the process of doing that because they were never in touch with their bodies. And so then at 22 or 23 or 24, whatever responsible age their church thinks that they can get married, they are given a wedding night where they are supposed to hand their body over to some man who they might love, they might have chosen, it depended on who the woman was, but then she is supposed to give her body to this man. And of course, she's not experiencing pleasure in this act because she doesn't know what she's doing and he doesn't know what he's doing. And then after that, what? Like, what happens next? Now he owns her body, that she takes his name. She becomes then the product of that new family, but she's not creating the family, she's becoming his family. And so they wrote about how this is a source of deep pain to them, that they can't experience an orgasm. They don't know how to find pleasure in their body. And they'll ask me, how did you find pleasure in your body? What did you do? How did you change? Where did you find this? And we know that the internet has these kind of answers theoretically, right? Because we're all so connected. But, you know, a lot of boys who might really have access to the internet might be watching porn on the internet, but that doesn't mean that they're getting real knowledge about pleasure and connection. And girls are probably, well, I mean, I don't want to say probably, I want to say the ones who wrote to me were saying that they did not know what to do other than to perform.
Right.
And
right.
I think
that's what you see if you go on the internet and you see pornography, is you see women performing.
Yes.
You don't see what it's like to experience.
And it's not filmed from a female perspective.
No.
So it's not meant to bring us pleasure, that particular entertainment form, right? So I'm not anti-porn, but I do think that when girls are taught that their bodies exist for the pleasure of men or for the purpose of bringing children into the world, that's very complicated in especially in a society where a woman may choose not to ever have a child, or may choose to have one or two children. It's not like her body is going to be in the service of motherhood for very much of her life, even if she chooses to be a mother. And there are many women who, of course, are choosing not to be mothers, which is also a very valid choice. And so then what is her body for? You know, if that is what you've been taught, then what does that body exist for? And so it's not owned by her, for her. It is always in service of something else. And it has been a really interesting dialogue. I was writing to, I don't want to say talking because we were not speaking. We were writing via email, a woman who found my email address, or she found a way to contact me through my website. And she lives in South Africa, and she was raised as a missionary in a cult. And she's a little bit older. I think she said she's 30. And she is now dating an atheist, and she's not married yet, but she has separated herself from the community of origin that was part of purity culture. And she's trying to figure out how to experience pleasure in her body, or how to prepare herself for being a partner, and what it would mean to be in a marriage of choice. You know, she's considering getting married, and she wants to know what do I need to know before I make that choice for myself? How much do I need to know about myself? And I just think these questions, again, it's questions. And I don't have answers. I said, well, here's some practices. In fact, she used the word practices, that particular woman did. And she said, can you tell me some of the practices you use or used to use that have helped you be in your own body? And I thought that was really beautiful. I said, yes, I can share those. I don't know which will work for you, but these are things that have helped me. And it felt like a really healthy way to have a conversation without, you know, coming from a position of, oh, I'll tell you what to do. I know everybody else told you what to do before, but now you should listen to me. Of course, I was encouraging her to listen to herself, but I could offer at least some ways that I learned to listen to myself. And I hopefully that's what we can do for each other, right? Is give opportunities to explore and to find what works for us.
That's beautiful. Yes, because then we allow the other person to discover and find what's true for them, right? If someone tells you what to do and this is like, seems like it's the way to do it, then, you know, if you want the result, you're like, well, I guess I better do what they say. But if somebody just gives you a list of ideas and says, try some of these things, right? Then you're going to select what feels resonant to you. Or maybe you're going to try a few and they're not going to work out, or they're going to try something and it works wonderfully. But it's going to be more of an experience of experimentation and learning rather than just following the recipe, right?
Yes, we can make our own recipes.
Yes, make your own recipe, because everybody has an individual body, an individual nervous system, and it's changing all the time. It's not static, it's not still, right? So that's beautiful. I love to hear about the way that you're stepping into some mentorship around this stuff, you know, just circumstantially, because pleasure really is an act of reclaiming your body. And especially when you've been through trauma, when you've been through the kind of life that you were born into, it's huge to come back in and be able to experience the joy of being in your body, the joy of living, because then you're going to want to live if it feels good, right? If living is painful and terrible, like, you're going to start to wonder what's the point.
Absolutely. And pleasure, I think, can be a real act of resistance for one. or man too, I think. I probably shouldn't have gendered that. But in my experience as a woman and talking to other women, I certainly think that it can be for a human being who happens to, for me, express herself as female.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, like we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, there's a whole nother story here that could be told about men who are indoctrinated into, you know, whether you want to call it toxic masculinity or patriarchal societies, where they are entrenched in these mind, what is the word you used earlier? Mind control. Right. They're entrenched in this mind control that actually has them deny like a full half of their humanity, their feminine side, right? Or the other half of like their masculinity that's not about overpowering, right? And they come out of that. How does that process work for them? How is it similar or different than a process that we've been talking about today that's female, right? There's a whole other side to this story that maybe
has in common, I think, the overriding of the body. So that's what we share, is that it is, no matter if you express yourself as male or female, if you are being taught to override your body and to not listen to your body and to not be aware of what is that you need to be your fullest self, that is not gendered. That is, you know, just a human experience of not being in your body. And then the way you choose to express it may be gendered, but we're both genders are being taught the same thing, which is that you cannot trust yourself.
Right, exactly. And then that, like we said before, disempowers you and makes you easier to control. Yeah. Well, this has been an absolutely amazing conversation. I'm sure we can keep going, but we're going to stop here. Maybe we'll have another interview later. I would love that if you're open. And I would love to invite our readers to connect with you on your website, which will be in the show notes, and read Forager, because it's really a fascinating journey into what it's like to grow up and be disconnected from your body. And there's so many reasons that we disconnect from ourselves, that disconnect from our bodies. And for me, stepping back into that through your writing, it made me discover how far along I have come from where I was when I was a teenager, you know, and had very similar thoughts and feelings to the child, you know, Michelle, that I was listening to.
Well, thank you for recognizing that, Amy. And listeners, you can also write me. I have an email on my website. So if you reach out, I will do my best to engage in conversation with you. So thank you for having me, Amy. Thank you for this enlightening conversation. I always learn something when I spend time with you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I feel the same way. We'll touch in again soon.
Okay. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Free Your Soma podcast. To find out more information about today's guest, check the show notes. And to find out more information about me, Amy Takaya, and the Radiance program, visit www.freeyoursoma.com.